Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's so nice to have so many people signing on for this program tonight, and it's great to be able to hear a few of your voices and see a few of your faces. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Horatio Joyce. Dr. Joyce is the Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and an expert on McKim, Mead White, and their clubhouse architecture. I just wanted to also say that Dr. Joyce was introduced to us through one of our longtime members, Mr. Alan Safir, who was supposed to be on the call tonight. I don't know if he's logged in or not. I may have to thank him at the end too if he pops on later. And I'm so pleased to have him share his fascinating research with all of you this evening. And I also want to thank one of our past presidents who's also on the call this evening, Bill Silver. He also assisted in making the introduction to Dr. Joyce and his work. And I also want to thank our special guest tonight, Sam White, who's the great grandson of Stanford White. And he will be introduced a little later in the evening by Dr. Joyce and join in the discussion. So without further ado, Horatio, we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us this evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Davina. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Brilliant. Well, yes, thank you, Davina. Thank you, Harmonie Club, for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to be speaking with real living Harmonie Club members. I say that because I am a historian, as it turns out, of clubs, of Gilded Age clubs, and specifically their club houses. And I have gotten to know in sometimes too much detail the history of your predecessors, of your founding members and their successors through the building, the design, the construction, and the occupation of your magnificent clubhouse today on East 60th Street. And we're looking right now at one of really my favorite photos of the Harmonie Club soon after it was finished and designed by McKim, Mead White and finished in 1905. So the sort of broad aim of today's talk is to give a sort of a beginning introduction to the very surprisingly interesting and sometimes complicated in a good way history of this building. And so the trajectory of the talk is to sort of end up with the construction and inhabitation of your present clubhouse. I want to say that my research, and I wrote an article recently, it was part of my dissertation research at the University of Oxford on gentlemen's clubhouses designed by McKim, Mead White. I've just worked out 6 years ago in New York City for my first research trip. And I arrived in the city and I was trying to work out how to tackle this project. And I found, understandably, that, you know, access to the clubhouses, access especially to the records of the clubs was going to be a key undertaking. I was really fortunate. I was in the right place at the right time. A very kind archivist at Columbia University offered to put me in touch with Mr. Samuel White, who I am delighted can join me in a discussion after my talk. Sam literally transformed my research overnight by opening many doors into Clubland, New York Clubland today, giving me access to the actual buildings, which as an architectural historian is so important, and helping me to locate the records, because a lot of the records just aren't accessible. And it's so important for an historian to really utilize the records. And I am so happy with the decision that the Harmonie Club took a number of years ago, as I understand it, to give their records to New York Historical Society, where they are beautifully cataloged and where I was able to access them with professional help of archivists at New York Historical Society. And so this research that I'm presenting is really based on the records that I used at New York Historical Society. And just one final point about public access of these records is because the records are, of course, important to your club, but as you'll see, and I hope to show, that they're also important to the social history of New York City, of even the United States. And this is a real exception. The Harmonie Club is special. They really speak to the history of America and the larger world, especially Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century. I'm especially interested in talking about women. Women in the clubhouse. You may have read that the Harmonie Club has its foundations in the rejection of certain founding members, German Jewish immigrants in the mid-19th century who came to the United States, and they were rejected. I think maybe this is one of the stories. They were rejected from gentlemen's clubs at that time in New York, and so they founded the Harmonie Club. Or you may have found your way onto Wikipedia, and I like other historians, often use Wikipedia, and it's surprisingly good. But there is some erroneous information, I have to tell you, on the Wikipedia page for the Harmonie Club. And that is that it was the second oldest gentlemen's club in New York, second only to the Union Club. Well, I want to argue that that's not true, but it's even better. The history of the Harmonie Club is even better than that. It's more interesting and more distinguished. And I put this picture up of Temple Emanu-El today as we know it, in its very grand quarters on Fifth Avenue, finished in the 1920s, to make the point that the Harmonie Club's real origins lie as a social club and a family club attached to Temple Emanu-El, at that time located in Lower Manhattan, downtown. And the two, really until quite late in the 19th century, occupied quarters very close to each other. That is the synagogue and the Harmonie Club. To put it more into context and to really understand the role that women and family played in the history of Temple Emanu-El, which isn't always apparent, especially if we are stubborn and we hold on to this idea that the Harmonie Club was a gentleman's club, which I'm trying to argue and show you that it wasn't. To put it in a sort of a larger context of the associations that Temple Emanu-El created for itself in the 19th century to cater to the congregation. So the Harmonie Club, I want to argue, was part of this larger associational world created by the congregation, the first Reformed congregation in New York City, to help its members socialize. So we have By Night Birth, we have the United Order of True Sisters, and the Harmonie Gesellschaft. I should say the Harmonie Club's original name was Harmonie Gesellschaft, which means simply Harmony Society, which is also a clue, I think, right, that it wasn't always imagined, the organization, as a gentleman's club, but rather as a sort of a different type of society. So a lot of these societies had practical reasons for setting up, like I didn't put up here, but there was also a burial society, a kindergarten society, and they catered to the social needs. They also were experiments, and the Harmonie Gesellschaft, later Harmonie Club, was imagined very much as an experiment in trying to imagine what Reformed Jewish life, particularly in the United States, would look like. And the United Order of True Sisters was a real sort of discovery for me in figuring out the sort of hidden history of women in the Harmonie Club. And I say that because the Harmonie Club was always limited in its membership to men. And so men, if you look at the records at New York Historical Society, it's only men who were able until quite late to be members. They occupied the important executive positions. They wrote the minutes. I love meeting minutes. And they were the ones who sort of represent the history and appear to make the decisions. But it didn't add up to me. I was seeing chapter after chapter in the history of the Harmonie clubhouses, what appeared to be sort of the women sort of coming forward and shaping really important moments in the history of the club. And so the United Order of the True Sisters, an association that predates the Harmonie Club by a few years, was key in my understanding that the Harmonie women from very early on, despite not being members themselves, were very assertive. And they believed, I believe they believed that they had a role to play outside the home in the public sphere. So in the 19th century, you may know, you may not know, but I'll say it very briefly now, the home becomes a really dominant theme. You cannot overestimate just how important this idea of the home becomes in the 19th century. It's sort of a lot of the emphasis that we give today, and that maybe we are sort of especially aware of because of the pandemic, and a lot of us are stuck at home. A lot of the emphasis on the home is created in the 19th century. And this idea originally was that women, their rightful place was the home, whereas men would go out into the public sphere, whereas women would stay in the domestic sphere. And this became a really dominant ideology. It wasn't necessarily a rule, it certainly wasn't a law, but it definitely structured a great deal of American life, and especially among elites, Protestant as well as German, increasingly as well as the German Jewish elite in New York City, the members of the Harmonie Club. Ooh, what's happening? Looks like someone is drawing on my slide. What the slide that we're looking at right now is an excerpt from the 1864 Constitution of the United Order of True Sisters, which is one of those associations created by the members of Temple Emanu-El, and specifically the wives of members of Temples Emanu-El. And it is the first organization, national organization for women, Jewish, Protestant, no denomination, just it's the first organization created by women in the United States. So this is a real sort of marker, a real important development in American history, outside Jewish history, outside Temple Emanu-El. And they are based rather remarkably on a men's organization, a fraternal order. And they are known as a female fraternal order. And like a fraternal order in the 19th century, they had all the usual aims and objectives, which included helping members who found themselves in difficult times, who had emergencies. But in this 1864 Constitution, where they state their aims, the sisters, as I'll call them, wrote, we are particularly, but particularly more so than helping other members in emergency, but particularly the development of free, independent, and well-considered action of its members. They want to cultivate this. And I'm reading, the women members are to expand their activities without neglecting their obligations as housekeepers in such a manner that, if necessary, they can participate in public meetings, discussions besides the man, not inferior to him. And as one historian whose work I'm very dependent on here has pointed out, this is radical stuff. Like, don't underestimate it. This is really exciting. It's what she calls a proto-feminist statement, a proto-feminist organization. So if can we keep in mind that the women of the United Order of the True Sisters, the sisters are also Harmonie Club members' wives, their daughters, and they are behind the scenes pressing for men to maintain a place for them in the clubhouse,
sharing the screen with them,
which isn't always the case, as we'll see. So in the 1860s, the late 1860s, Temple Emanu-El and the Harmonie Club, they decide to move uptown. And because they're really, sister or mother and child organizations, they decide to move together. And more than that, they move together within just a sort of a block of one another in Midtown Manhattan near the present-day Bryant Park, and they hire the same architect, Henry Fernbach, and we're looking here at the first purpose-built Temple Emanu-El, designed by architect Henry Fernbach, a Jewish architect, designed in the Moorish style on Fifth Avenue, which was a design quite common in Central Europe, so one that would have probably been familiar to the members themselves. Virtually around the corner, facing present-day Bryant Park on West 42nd Street, we have this great photograph from the Museum of the City of New York, showing the new first purpose-built Harmonie Club quarters on West 42nd Street, completed within a year of the new Temple Emanu-El around the corner. We really see this sort of focus and emphasis on the family blossom. It really does, it blossoms, it blooms within this clubhouse. And that's because it really prioritizes women's participation, families' participation. On the second floor of the club, architectural historians refer to a second floor because it's the most prestigious, usually informal designed buildings, as the Piano Nobile. And the Piano Nobile of the West 42nd Street Clubhouse was occupied by a music room, a ballroom, and a series of women's accommodation, as it was described. We don't have any, or I can't find, maybe some of the members this evening know of them out there, but any drawings, interior drawings, and photographs of the interiors from the 1860s and the 1870s of the West 42nd Street Clubhouse. But I was able to overcome the visual restrictions on imagining life within the clubhouse. Because of this one, there is one exception, one illustration here, which I've taken from a Harmonie Club commissioned history showing the 1877 ball and anniversary of the 25th, in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the club. Here we can quite clearly see at the West 42nd Street Clubhouse, women, families gathering to celebrate the 25th birthday of their club in their very, obviously, quite clearly ornate ballroom. It's a festive occasion. I became very sort of reliant.
Dr. Joyce, we have a question from the audience, if you don't mind, about women.
Yes.
Dr. Gutstein was wondering, at this time in the history, did women have any leadership positions within Temple Emanu-El or the Harmonie Club?
No, not in the Harmonie Club, and as far as I know, nor in Temple Emanu-El. But I can't say for certain if that was the case for Temple Emanu-El, but certainly not in the Harmonie Club. Membership really was restricted to, that is, membership of the Harmonie Club was restricted to men. In other ways, though, Temple Emanu-El, and this relates back to the Harmonie Club and the role that family played in the Harmonie Club, Temple Emanu-El was the first in the country and the second in the nation to combine seating for men and women. At one point, they occupied what had been a Christian church downtown. That was their premises just before they moved to the purpose-built building I showed you, and they retained the pews, the family pews, and they decided not to change it. So women within the Temple Emanu-El, while I don't think that they had any formal power roles within the congregation, they were given what was at the time quite exceptional accommodation within the congregation. That is, they were able to sit with the male members of their family. So I became reliant and engrossed in one aspect of the New York Historical Society's records of the Harmonie Club, and that is its marvelous scrapbooks. And they begin their scrapbooks collecting, members begin collecting all sorts of ephemera related to the Harmonie Club. In 1867, the same year, rather in 1868, the same year that the new clubhouse, their first purpose-built clubhouse in West 42nd Street opens. And they just, they really are meticulous, and they record any sort of piece of paper that comes their ways that relates to the history of what's going on in the club. They paste very carefully down in this scrapbook, which of course has its practical business purposes. You want to keep records, right? But it also seems to me that it's sort of it was an effort to really create a sense of belonging, create a sense of identity wrapped around their new building. That this was, the opening of the building was an occasion to really think about themselves more than ever as an association tied to a specific place. And that's what really interests me in my work, the relationship between people and buildings. And the Harmonie Club is such a great story because it's particularly powerful. This sort of high point in the Harmonie Club's history in the 19th century only lasts for a few years. It's sort of the 1870s is very good. You see, and just to go back to that slide, what we were looking at was receipts and invoices for the opening banquet. So on the lower right-hand corner, you see ice. There were like 30 pages of invoices. What must have been a magnificent feast to celebrate the opening of the Harmonie Club. I just think a historian of food culture, and there is a growing field of food culture, would love to see this. So spread the word that there's some really good stuff to be mined by all sorts of scholars. So 1870s is good. People are happy. They've achieved this great accomplishment of having built the clubhouse. And then I found at the beginning of the second scrapbook, the second volume of the scrapbook for the 1880s, this document says the St. Nicholas Club, 1882. And it was the first piece of ephemera I'd come across in the scrapbooks that didn't obviously relate to the Harmonie Club. So I was immediately suspicious, and I sensed that something had happened in the 1880s. Before I knew what exactly had happened or why it had happened, clearly something important was beginning to change in the history of the Harmonie Club. And this was my clue. And so it was a mystery to me, and maybe I hope it's a bit of a mystery to you. I want to know, why were Harmonie Club members suddenly, it appeared, becoming more self-conscious, not so much celebrating themselves and their mixed entertainments for men and women, but were also quite clearly now aware of other clubs, contemporary clubs within New York City. And the St. Nicholas Club, as I discovered when I opened the booklet, it was a yearbook, so it contained copies of the club's constitution, its list of members and officers. It was essentially a gentleman's club, not a family club. The St. Nicholas Club was a Protestant elite gentleman's club. So why, my sort of driving research question became, why was it that the Harmonie Club members were looking at gentlemen's club? Could it be that they want to reinvent themselves into a gentleman's club, to sort of remove women from the clubhouse, from the life of the club, and transform into a gentleman's club? The answer, it seemed, was yes. And as I looked more closely at the records, I could see really very strong evidence of this desire to reform the club. In 1882, the same year that the St. Nicholas Club yearbook was published, Harmonie Club members, I discovered, had petitioned to ease restrictions on the use of English in the club. German was its official language then. They were unsuccessful, this time at least, as was the first recorded attempt in the 1880s to restrict women's use of the clubhouse. Other early attempts at reform, however, were successful. For example, the 1882-1883 season saw the Entertainment Committee put on the club's first all-male events, a series of stag parties, and we see one of the invitations to a stag party here. So in a way, quite it continues what I came to know of sort of Harmonie sensibility, its cartoons and its invitation, but here's an invitation for an all-male event. Suddenly, the Harmonie Club ceases to focus exclusively on families and now has something for just men within the clubhouse. And here is the clubhouse itself, West 42nd Street. And stag parties became a really regular feature of the club entertainments. In 1889, reformers succeeded in convincing club leaders to permit the use of English in Harmonie debates. This was their third attempt to integrate the English language into club activities. The club finally switched to English as its official language in 1893, with German then permitted for a time in debates before being abolished altogether. In 1892, the Board of Governors relieved itself of the responsibility of overseeing the admission of new members by creating a specialized admissions committee, a standard practice in other gentlemen's clubs, including the St. Nicholas. In 1894, the organization changed its name from Gesellschaft Harmonie to Harmonie Club. So real efforts and sometimes successful efforts are being made to move the club in the direction of a Protestant gentleman's club. So why? That became a driving question for me. And the answer I discovered was rising Protestant anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. For much of the 19th century, Protestant elites and Jewish elites had civil relations. They were able to sometimes, and sometimes quite frequently, share social spaces. interact in business and in society. But by the late 19th century, we really begin to see this disappear. And the reforms of the Harmonie, the efforts to remake it as a gentleman's club, are related to this rise of anti-Semitism and the particular form it took. And the particular form that this anti-Semitism took was that it chastised, it cast, it painted American Jews, including German Jews, as cultish, as ignoring the dominant gender conventions, which were, as I've said, this idea of separate spheres for men and separate spheres for women, with women at home. And the Harmonie Club became a sort of a source of embarrassment and concern for German Jewish businessmen. It was a sort of a real, very public declaration that here they were socializing in a way that Protestant elites didn't agree with. And more than that, was sort of a source of their anti-Semitism. These Protestant elites were driven to become anti-Semites because they were at this time beginning to, they're looking for a way to consolidate as a class. We're talking about the Gilded Age. This is the late 19th century. There's a great deal of wealth, and it's a new sort of capitalist, corporate capitalist wealth. So companies for the very first time are consolidating, and the economic system is really changing quite sort of dramatically in a really sort of monumental way. And the businessmen behind this change in the American economy are mostly sort of railroad executives at this point and major financiers such as J.P. Morgan. And they are more than just looking for a way to consolidate their business and sort of change the economic system. They are also at the same time looking to consolidate as a society, to really become an elite capitalist class. And one of the ways, one of the probably most important ways they do this is they self-identify through anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism becomes a class marker, a class language. There's also an economic incentive for anti-Semitism at this point. Many of the members of the Harmonie Club were in the same businesses as Protestant elites, and by excluding German Jews socially, there was a real opportunity to acquire, to appropriate German Jewish business for themselves. So that's the backstory, and that's why we see the rise of anti-Semitism and a particular form of anti-Semitism which made the Harmonie Club very self-conscious about its mixed entertainments. And just as sort of evidence of this view of the Harmonie Club as being other and different and sort of badly so, is I have an excerpt here from the very popular guidebook, the 1893 King's Handbook to New York, which was sold to tourists and New York citizens alike as a guidebook to the city. And it included a section on clubs. And the Harmonie Club section, and you can see the section just beginning on the lower left, says, and I'm reading it right now, the Harmonie Club blah, 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 is the most homelike and jealous regard for privacy. And then further down, it says that it's an aristocratic club with the characteristic that members attend it with their wives, if they please. So if you didn't know this back history about the rise of anti-Semitism, you might pass over that quite quickly. But I hope now that we have the context, that this is a loaded description of the Harmonie Club. It's a really popular handbook, almost ubiquitous in New York City and around the country as a guide to New York City. So if Harmonie Club members read this, they might have really they winced. Let's say they could have winced, and they really would have been resolved more than ever that women, they really had to resolve the question of women and family in the clubhouse. This was bad publicity. Women, however, the Harmonie women quite clearly were not just going to sit down and let their husbands and sons and brothers just force them out of the club. And that's exactly what we begin to see in the 1880s. There's a real effort to extricate women from the club. And the most, sort of the early great example of women really saying, no, we are not going to just let you exclude us from the life of the Harmonie Club. We are actually going to try and exploit the situation is through the remodeling of the club in the 1890s, of the clubhouse in West 42nd Street, and sort of the chaos of this moment, members really sort of become divided. There's a lot of conflict. The great sort of felicitous moment of the 1870s, where members got along and were able to socialize, begins to really fall apart, quite understandably, in response to the rising anti-Semitism. And it really divides the membership about what it is, how will the club move forward? Should it become a gentleman's club, or should it retain its older traditional function as a family club? And so they're sort of immobilized, and they try to move uptown into a new purpose-built gentleman's club, but they really are immobilized. They can't get enough of a vote either way, whether to retain the family functions or to build a gentleman's club. Anyway, it appears that, what they do is they settle on remodeling the clubhouse in West 42nd Street. They extensively remodel the main block, which is on the left, and you can see it as it was built in 1867. But they also, after the remodeling, they build an annex in the garden just to the east. So that's to the right of our screen. We can see the remodeled Harmonie Club on West 42nd. You can probably detect some changes in the main facade, the removal of the stoop, for example. But the real interesting change and really addition is to the east, to the right. And that is they fill in the garden, they build what's called a ladies' annex. And it's 3 stories high, it has a wonderful glass conservatory at the top, and back down on street level, what you see a separate door. So women have gained a club unto themselves. And while they may have at this point lost some of their rights and privileges within the main clubhouse, what they gain is a world, a space unto themselves. And I think that this is a really important gain, and maybe sort of overrides any sort of loss of presence in the main clubhouse. They gain a clubhouse for themselves. And again, while we don't have, unfortunately, as far as I know, any visual evidence about what the new ladies' annex on West 42nd Street looked like inside, we can gather a sense of how it worked from the addition of 2 new club rules. And we're looking at, in the late 1890s, they revised the house rules after they remodeled the club and added the women's annex. And we can see rules number 4 and 5 are new additions, and they pertain to the ladies' annex and how it's going to be governed. And that is, in rule 4, they pretty much say that women can attend the annex independently of their husbands. Their husbands don't have to be in the clubhouse. Rule 5 says if the husband allows, the women can have an account at the women's restaurant. So there's a women's restaurant, there's a women's lounge, there's a women's conservatory. This is a real women's sphere outside the home. And again, I really can't stress enough that this is radical stuff. This is as radical, if we can recall at the beginning, the sisters fraternity, the radical statement about women having a role outside the home. And this is I think this is a real demonstration of women, Harmonie Club women, asserting themselves, exploiting in a way the chaos within the club, and erecting this terrific facility which they can use as they shop on what was called Ladies' Mile, which at that point ran right past, or practically right past, the Harmonie Clubhouse in West 42nd Street. The downside to all of this is that it probably enraged the most reform-minded members of the Harmonie Club. That is, those members of the Harmonie Club who were really set on transforming their institution into a gentleman's club. These are probably going to be the younger members, the ones who have most to lose in business, who are fearful that Protestant elites are only too ready to steal business and to really challenge their sense of self as elites, which was quite rightfully theirs as very prosperous and successful businessmen.
Dr. Joyce, we had another question about the ladies' annex.
Yes.
Did any of the materials in the history that you researched talk about how the ladies' annex was paid for, or the funds were raised for it?
Good question. If I may, is sort of this question asking, did the ladies raise the funds themselves? I don't remember seeing that. But that's a good question, and it would be one to go back into the archives to look for, because that could be really interesting. That's a really good question and a really good direction for future research on the club, which really does need to be done because it's a history of a great institution, but really it's an institutional history that speaks right to this larger social history of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If the Harmonie women had raised money, I would not be surprised. They raised a good deal of money. They were in charge of hundreds of thousands of dollars by the late 1890s through the Sisters fraternity, which they operated, I think, their own hospitals. They had a magazine at this point. It was a business venture. At a time when very few women were given control of money, the Harmonie women, had they funded their own annex, would have been more than capable. That's a great question. Thank you.
Had just one other one pop up about this topic, well, women in general. When did the Harmonie Club allow female candidates for membership, and did that not happen until they were in the new clubhouse?
That's outside
about widowers?
Period. I don't. Davina, do you know?
We know the answer. Yes, I believe our first woman member is here on the call tonight, Susie Jaffe. I believe the year was 1986.
Wow. Which is not, and Sam and I plan to speak more. I mean, that's so late. And how wonderful to have you on the call. I hope you're here. But that, and Sam and we plan to talk about this to bring the history up to date, if you will, of the Harmonie Club and and more generally. Yeah.
Speaking of that, we should probably try to get to Sam fairly soon. We're,
okay, yes.
Coming on 6:43.
Okay. So they hire McKim White. There is a real effort, probably in response to the annex, to build a gentleman's club. Who do you hire to build a gentleman's club in New York City at this time? You hire the great gentleman's club architects McKim White. We are looking at a selection of their clubhouses just prior to the commission to build the Harmonie Clubhouse. If you want to turn yourself into a gentleman's club, well, they hire McKim White, and that's exactly what they do. We are looking at a McKim White drawing of the new East 60th Street clubhouse on the exterior. Surprise or not so surprisingly, despite the original efforts to build a gentleman's club on East 60th Street, we actually continue to see women's accommodation within the clubhouse. So you have the East 60th Street entrance for members, but to the left, what? A second door, a smaller door? It's a women's entrance. And looking on the plan to the right, we can follow that entrance in to what's labeled the ladies' entrance, and we can imagine that they were, you can see a cloakroom over a counter. They'd hand their cloak to the attendant. They could go into the ladies' reception room to the left, which had obviously a fireplace, and from the bills, I know that had somewhat comfy, not really comfy club chairs. So this wasn't a place to really rest and get comfy, but it was a way station somewhere to pause before they then made their way. This is the Harmonie women to the back of their suite here on the ground floor to the lobby, where they would rejoin members because they have rooms above and below. Even in the sort of gentleman's club, there were Harmonie women rooms above and below. Above, they had their own dining room adjacent to the men's dining room, which we see here, which, as far as I can tell from the bills, probably wasn't that different in its interior decoration to the women's dining room, which is just behind us. So in closing, McKim White are hired to transform the club into a gentleman's club, but it quickly becomes clear to the Harmonie members that actually they don't really need to transform as thoroughly as they thought they did to make themselves into a gentleman's club, but they had sort of overestimated the gentlemanliness, the masculinity of a Protestant gentleman's club, because there were cases, buildings, clubhouses built by McKim, Mead, and White themselves, including the Metropolitan Club, that actually had some degree of women's accommodation. And so McKim, Mead, and White turn out to really be great architects for the commission, in that they help the club feel like a gentleman's club, but also resolve a lot of the design issues with incorporating a women's accommodation into the clubhouse. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor.
So we're moving to the best part of the show. Mr. Sam White, who is himself an architect and a partner in his firm, and as I've said, a great-grandson of Stanford White, and a distinguished published author on McKim, Mead, and White, and a personal hero because he really has helped me develop this research. So, as requested, Sam loves this photo, and it is a great photo. This is another interior of the Clubhouse, McKim White Harmonie Clubhouse on East 60th Street, showing the billiards room. Oh my God, these billiard tables. I know all about them, the fighting, about getting lots and lots of billiards tables. So, Sam, what do you think about us talking about?
I love Horatio. I love this picture. I mean, first of all, looking at this picture, it's very hard to argue that the Harmonie Club was not a bastion of masculinity.
Yeah.
And also the other thing I love is the carpet. Look at the rugs around the tables. I mean, it's just, I'd never seen anything like that.
Billiards was so important to bachelor culture, and I'll just say briefly that, despite the women's accommodation within the clubhouse, a lot of the other floors within the Harmonie Clubhouse really gave over to what was a very dominant bachelor culture. This very often misogynistic and sexist bachelor culture, and billiards was, for better or worse, a real feature of the culture. So let's try and aim, go bring ourselves up to the 1980s. So Davina, it was 1986, you said, when the Harmonie Club admits its first female member?
I believe so, yes.
1986, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, all those clubhouses that you showed in your lecture, they were essentially built between 1880 and 1910. It was the great era, as you say, of clubhouse building in New York City. But there is another, and that's a 30-year, 3-decade period. There's a date that was the second sort of earthquake to hit New York club world, and that is in 1988, when the Supreme Court upheld the validity of New York City's local law 63, which said that, essentially it said that these clubs claimed to be private clubs and therefore could discriminate on any basis they wanted to. The Supreme Court in New York City said, well, in fact, you're not private clubs, you're public facilities because you have events for outside members, non-members. And this caused a massive scramble all over the city of New York, and a lot of these clubs, I mean, some of them had seen which way the wind was blowing and had made accommodations before that. But after 1988, I think only 2 clubs in New York can still establish that they are private clubs by the definition of local law 63, and the rest of them had to scramble around pretty quickly to find places for ladies to use the powder room.
And were you involved in any of that?
No, I was barely born, Horatio.
You wanted me to say that so you could say that.
No, I was aware it was going on. I mean, I know that, at the Century, it was terribly bitter. Interestingly, at the Metropolitan Club, or actually not the Metropolitan, the University Club admitted women in 1987, a year before the Supreme Court ruling. And that was there was enormous pressure, obviously, to admit women. I mean, it was just crazy not to. But you had to get, these things are democratic institutions, and you have to the House committee has to approve a motion, and it has to be put before the membership at a general meeting, and it's very hard to get.
When you don't have women.
Sorry?
Well, democratic to an extent.
Yeah, to an extent, yeah. But I mean, you could barely get a House rule approved to say that the sky was blue under those circumstances.
Right.
But at the University Club, I think the way it was done was that there was a group of members who wanted to be able to pay their dues with a business check. And there was a group of members who wanted women to be able to be members. And neither of these agendas had sufficient votes to carry in a general meeting of the club, but combined, they could. And that's how women were admitted to the University Club a year before the Supreme Court brought the hammer down on the rest of them. The Harmonie is so interesting because they were yes, I mean, they admitted women, but women were in the DNA of the Harmony Club, and in spite of what you were describing.
Yeah. I should say, Sam, I've never told you this, but quite early on, we had lunch together, and you and I was investigating the Harmony Club, and you said to me, "Oh my goodness, that must be a great New York story." I thought, you know what? From what I can tell, I think it is a great New York story, and that really it helped me to sort of frame my research and to sort of work out what was happening and to think about it as a great New York story. So yeah, it's in the DNA. It's an unusual place. So one thing that I've come across in my research, which was unexpected, was the recrudescence of club life today. That in a way, my interest in clubs is underlined by a revival of interest in traditional club life, such as the Harmony Club as one example, along with the other McKim Mead White clubs that are doing, it seems, at least from the outside, like the Century Association and the Harvard Club, appear to be doing quite well, if not better than they have in a long time. Maybe Davina can weigh in on this as well. But architecturally, has that resulted, sort of the revival of interest in club life, and any sort of interesting commissions, developments?
Well, these things, as anyone who has ever sat on a house committee of any club knows, it is very, very difficult to make these kinds of changes.
Yeah.
And there are lots of suggestions, and then they sort of exist as suggestions, and then they exist as debates. I think one of these clubs once wanted to try to raise a little money by changing some rooms in the maids' rooms in the top floor into sleeping quarters, and it just, it was as if you had unleashed a stink bomb in the clubhouse, just the objections to it. So changes come very, very slow to these. I mean, now we're in New York City, and physical changes are expensive. They typically would involve some kind of assessment to the members or increased indebtedness on the part of the club. But there have been some successful ones. I mean, right across the street, the Metropolitan Club about 10 or 15 years ago built that a greenhouse on the roof, which has been very successful, I think, and caused a lot of other clubs to say, we wish we had one too. I mean, you remember that the original design for the Harmony included a roof garden. You might want to say something about that.
Yeah, so a lot of McKim Mead White's clubs included a roof garden, and in fact, I can trace it all the way back to McKim Mead White's very earliest design, which was actually an unsuccessful bid to build the Union League Club in 1879, which was the same year actually McKim Mead White formed, that they became partners, the three principals, and they incorporated a roof garden on their designs in the competition for the Union League Clubhouse. And I remember reading, the articles, the responses in the architectural press, and they were actually lambasted for including a roof garden. But clearly it's popular and continues to be popular amongst, McKim Mead White clubs and other clubs. So a real feature. And there was one at the Harmony Club as well, originally, before the squash courts, right?
I got lost from the squash courts. I was looking, the other day I was looking at some films of the construction of the Chrysler building. And one of the things that struck me was how polluted the air in New York City was.
Yeah.
That you can see why people thought that a roof garden was just a terrible idea, because you could barely see 2 blocks.
But maybe it was also better up there. Maybe it was heavy pollution, and so once it got a little high, no, really, especially
now New York City is paradise compared to what it was
the pandemic
years ago.
Well, speaking of the pandemic and its positive effects on climate and pollution, what's your predictions for clubhouse architecture in the post-pandemic?
Well, I predict, first of all, that these clubs, which are suffering very terribly right now because of high fixed costs, I mean, just the plant and to some extent, they're probably doing the right thing by their employees. I think they will have a happy resurgence. I mean, I think everybody misses their club, once we're permitted to go back, I think everybody is really looking forward to going back and seeing their friends at their club. I think this makes everyone realize, in fact, how much you really like these clubs and like walking in the door and being greeted by the person at the door and having the guy taking your coat know who you are. So there is I think we all really miss this terribly. That will cool down. And then I think the club managers, I mean, this is Davina, is going to have to try to figure out how to maintain social distancing in the dining room. And we've all been reading about people putting, mannequins in every other chair. I don't know if that's going to go over well.
I think it's a little creepy.
Yeah.
Not gonna go that route.
Fortunately, we have nice big rooms at the Harmony Club, so we're hoping that we'll be able to spread people out and ease back into club life at some point. We did get a couple of questions that are kind of more broad-based questions, not so much about New York clubs, but clubs in general, and you may or may not know the answers or be able to comment. The first one was, were there comparable developments of Jewish clubs in London? I don't know if you would know that as part of your research.
I can't say definitively. I know that the number of clubs, Jewish clubs in New York, were remarkably high. And as they were across the board, New York clubland was really second only to London clubs. Mm-hmm. So you might think that if you're looking for a large population of Jewish clubs, you might look to London. As much as I know about British Jewish history, the Jewish population in Britain was never as substantial as it was in the US, right? It had these great waves of immigrants from Europe. So I don't, but
I've not heard of any.
No, yeah, okay. Yeah, so that's, I think probably not. But someone would have to do more work on that. The only other Jewish club in another city I've heard about, and maybe even two, were in Boston.
Oh, really? I don't know of any in Boston, actually.
Before, I don't know, it's probably not still open, but this was...
maybe earlier. As far as I know, there aren't any in Boston today. Oh, there are country clubs, but not in the city. And the other question was, do you know if the Standard Club and Progressive Club in Atlanta have similar history and story? You probably don't know about that. Standard Club is in Chicago, and actually they unfortunately recently closed their doors. And I'm not familiar with the Progressive Club in Atlanta, but we could look into that. And somebody asked what the billiard room is used for today. I can answer that. It's the Harmony room where we do a lot of our member events. It was at one time, actually, when I first started working at the club, at first it was the card room for a period of time. And I guess that was filled with card players and cigar smokers all through the, maybe the 60s and 70s, and perhaps into the 80s. And then sometime about maybe 25 years ago, they actually made it into a grill room type of sports bar. And that didn't work out too well, unfortunately. So now today it's an event space.
But Davina, these clubhouses they're mixed use buildings, multi-purpose buildings with a huge variety of sizes of spaces and types of spaces and ceiling heights and location with respect to light and I mean it's not the cheapest thing in the world, but they are remarkably flexible, and they have a real history in terms of the way these rooms are used for different purposes at different times.
Right. The swimming pool was once a bowling alley in the original clubhouse. Did you come across that, Horatio, in your...
Yeah.
So there was a bowling club, and
it had actually the three sort of purpose-designed women's spaces on East 60th Street, as far as I know, were the reception room, which we talked about, on the ground floor, the dining room adjacent to the members' dining room, but also in the bowels of the clubhouse, in the basement, there was a separate women's changing room originally for the bowling alley, the same size as the men's changing room.
Oh, well, now that is interesting. So it looks like we went back and forth throughout the years, because when they built the pool, the only locker room was for men. And the women were able to use it for a few hours in the morning.
Scheduled only, all nude swimming. So
So it looks like it's been sort of a constant battle over the history of the club, right up to the present.
One of the clubs designed by McKim, Mead White was the Colony Club, which they designed in 1904 on Madison Avenue in the 28th to 29th Street. And that's now the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. And it had a swimming pool in the basement. And the American Academy of Dramatic Arts uses the swimming pool to store all of the costumes which they have as part of their sort of inventory for their programs. Sort of it's the most unusual adaptive reuse of a swimming pool I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's a great building, not in great shape though.
No, they got a ton of dough, to use the expression, selling their air rights to a very big building that's gone up right behind them. And what they're going to do with it, I don't know. But I would assume that the Landmarks Commission would have required them, or would require them, to clean that building up. I mean, it's a beautiful building, and it just looks so sort of ignored. And
the facade is so intricate, the brickwork. And as I understand, and as I remember, it has a permanent scaffold outside. So they really ought to spend the money and restore that facade. May I just have a shout out? So I based my research, this presentation, on an article I recently published very late last year in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. And the titles here: The Harmonie in the Clubhouse, Exclusion, Identity, and the Making of McKim White's Harmonie Club of New York City, which is freely available in a PDF form from my academia.edu webpage. And I put the link right there. If you're interested in reading in more detail about the history, please I invite you to read my work. How wonderful for a scholar to have his work read or widely.
I'm gonna corroborate Horatio's shout out. Horatio is going to get into big trouble with the world of academia, because this article is written in very clear English, which suggests that I don't know where Horatio got his PhD, but he doesn't understand that PhDs are supposed to write things that no human being can possibly read or understand. And here he wrote an article that's just lucid as the sky is blue. It's a wonderful article. I recommend it.
Thank you. Please read, yes.
Yes, excellent article. I believe that's the same. Is that the same one that I received, Horatio?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
also has a copy.
It's absolutely fascinating. I'd love to be able to somehow. Oh, so this is how members can access it.
That's right.
Are we able to put this link on our website for members?
So the danger, just to be frank, is because it's a journal, and they're always struggling. It's an academic journal. They're always struggling financially. I don't have the rights to this material. It's been published by them, and I sort of just got tacit permission to post it on my private academia.edu webpage, but it's a little murky about what else can be done, if anything. But it is.
We'll talk further about it, but it is a fascinating paper, and actually you get into quite a few things. We didn't have time to obviously cover everything tonight, but I believe there is a section on the sort of funding and politics that went on with the building of the new clubhouse and the annex before that on the 42nd Street Clubhouse. It's quite fascinating. So hopefully members will get a chance to read that, and it's so interesting. And thank you so much for
thank you very
much
for the opportunity.
I'm not trying to cut you short.
We have just a few other questions if you have a moment. People were wondering what happened to the former clubhouses, if you know the status of those buildings in Manhattan.
What happened to What happened to West 42nd Street? So
it's under a very big office building.
So I can say one thing about that was the driving factor behind the removal of the club to a new location was, as I've discussed, the question of should it be a gentleman's clubhouse, but also they sort of were pushed in the direction of relocating because they had a very unusual arrangement on West 42nd Street. And that arrangement was that they owned the building, but not the land. They had a ground lease, which was not uncommon in the first half of the 19th century, but was unusual by the time they built in the 1860s. And so By the time they built their Mead White Clubhouse, there were only a few more years left on that lease. So they, it would have reverted to the owner of the land at that point. So I would imagine because it becomes so valuable, that real estate, it was quite quickly demolished and replaced by a much larger piece of real estate.
Very interesting. One of our past presidents, Mr. Werble, also mentioned an interesting piece of information. He said in the early 20th century, there was a Jewish social club in Selma, Alabama, of all places, with one of the and it was one of the grandest buildings in the city. So he thought you might be interested in that for research, since it was such a unique place to have it.
There was a very successful and somewhat large, as I understand it, elite Jewish community in the South. If anyone has recommendations, I'd love to know more about that community, and also it's clubs. That'd be very interesting. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, I don't see any other new questions in our chat feature. So I do want to say thank you to you, Dr. Joyce, and Mr. White. We're so pleased to have both of you here, and very excited to learn more about our own history. So thank you, thank you.
Wonderful.
You are entirely welcome. Thank you, Horatio. This is great.
Thank you, Sam.
For all of those members who are still logged in, we encourage you to keep tabs on our upcoming events calendar. We have several events still coming up, including a very exciting comedy show from home on June 10th, a kids cooking class, a series of them for your little ones, as well as a 3-part wine master class starting this Tuesday for the next 3 Tuesdays. So please keep an eye and visit the virtual resources on our club's app or on the website. And that's all we have for tonight. Thank you so much again, Dr. Joyce and Mr. White. We're again just thrilled to have you.